Hello, I'm Pete Simcoe, freelance designer, and this is Jim Malcolm of Humanized Technologies. Hi, Jim.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I recognize you from a couple of weeks ago.
Absolutely. We were here with our first kind of dive into a discussion about virtual reality video in
Yes,
virtual reality. And you know
absolutely.
what? We said, hey, we're going to do it again. And that day has come.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's good to be here. What's been happening in the last couple of weeks?
I've tried to stay busy. I went off to our headquarters, which is based in Israel, just outside of
Right.
Jerusalem.
Yes.
And I was able to work with the development team there, work on some roadmaps, long-term stuff, as well as some short-term fixes like firmware updates and other
Ah.
pieces for all of our existing customers.
And in fact, there's a firmware update for the VuzeXR today. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I noticed earlier on.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we just had a new drop today.
Hmm.
It includes some simplified menus. It gives you some
Right.
more controls, a little bit better to do exposure compensation, exposure controls.
Hmm.
We're still working on getting the actual manual exposures all finalized and in place.
Okay.
So
Okay.
all of that kind of builds up, but if you're a current VuzeXR camera owner, it's best to download the latest version of the firmware, and you'll see some new stuff coming in, as well as
Absolutely.
the new apps as well.
There seem to be some updates regarding underwater, from what I read. So you're encouraging people
That's right.
to take the cameras, maybe buy a case before you do that, of course. But yeah. So there's a few. This seems to be part of the firmware update is kind of underwater, and does that affect? So I guess that affects the way the lenses are need to be stitched. Is that right? Is that what that particularly
That's
affects?
right. So
Okay.
there's actually a lot that happens when you image underwater. So
Hmm.
yes, the refraction from the water in the enclosure itself means we
Hmm.
have to change how we stitch, right? All of the
Right.
math behind it.
Okay.
But then also things like color correction, we
Yes.
also have to
Absolutely.
take into, right, in order
Hmm.
to do our best to color balance underwater.
Okay, so does that account for? So that's going to account for a kind of blue cast over everything in the scene. Is that correct?
If you shoot in underwater mode outside,
Yes.
yes, you'll see a weird color cast. But underwater,
Aha.
we
Everything is
try to
balanced.
average it all out, and
Absolutely.
it balances based on where you are in the world, what kind
Ah,
of water you're in, and what
really?
your depth is. Because as
Really?
you go down, the color temperature actually changes. So, there's a
Yes.
whole bunch of
Yes.
averages that have to happen in order to try to give you, the best overall kind of exposure and color, regardless of where you're diving.
So it's not a simple color picker of let's make it slightly more green and red.
No, it's not, and it's interesting because as you travel around the
Hmm.
world, color temperature is actually different depending on where you are in the world as well. Um, there, where you're at in the UK, we tend to have a bit more green in the spectrum.
Uh,
So
yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot in the rivers in the UK, so I wouldn't.
exactly,
I can't see crystal blue waters behind me, shall we say? So
not so,
and
not so much.
you've caught it on a sunny day as well. So what's interesting, Jim, is that one of the things that I did when I took this photograph, particularly, and I'll just kind of zoom around a bit. You can see St. Paul's in the distance there. I actually took two or three exposures of the scene and combined them in Photoshop because I wanted to get a really nice blue sky. Let's just flip the camera around here for a second. A really nice blue sky, but also capture some of these shadows and ensure that the highlights weren't completely sort of blown out. And there you see a reasonable, that's the brightest area there. You see a reasonable mix right round through to some of the really nice colors and definition on this particular image. So I did take advantage, as I say, of the exposure value kind of feature on the XR app. And just as a reminder, if people haven't used that, if you hold down the screen, so you've got the preview screen, if you push just briefly,
Yep.
then an exposure dial comes up. And my question to you when we met the other day just to talk about our next presentation, I asked you about ISO and I asked you about exposure and I asked you how the VuzeXR actually created that additional brightness and darkness. And you mentioned it was a combination between ISO and also, I think, was it shutter speed as well? I think.
Yeah, because if you think about a camera, there's really three conditions that you can use to affect your exposure, right?
Yes.
So one is, look at this.
This is a diagram from my book, which I will shamelessly plug in a moment. But here's the here's the diagram.
There you go. So ISO, which gives you the sensitivity, right? That's how much light or how quickly the sensor records the light.
Yes.
Then you have your aperture and you have your shutter speed. Well, on the Vuz cameras, and quite frankly, most all of the 360 and VR cameras right now, they have what's called a fixed aperture. In our case, it's an f2.8. So we can't change that variable. We know that that is fixed. So then we can adjust our exposure up and down. However, if we get to a point where exposure all the way up, for example, still doesn't give us enough brightness, what we then do is shift the ISO, which is the sensitivity, to make the sensor more sensitive so that we have room to do it. So if we can keep a constant ISO, that's the best. And then we just change the shutter speed. However, but the dynamic range of the scenes, when you start shooting in 360, you know, you have very, very dark shadows underneath the bench over there, or the sides of the boats out here. All the way up to very, very high highlights and reflective areas. So that dynamic range is very broad and much broader than you would even find in a traditional camera. So because we have to deal with everything from bright sun to deep shadows in a global exposure, that's why we have to move so many variables.
Absolutely. And I think what I mentioned, we were talking the other day about ISO, and just in case people aren't aware, the sensitivity of the camera, if you set the ISO quite high, it tends to build a little more noise. And this is universal for all cameras. It builds a little more noise into the image. And so from a photographer's point of view, it's ideal to keep the ISO as low as possible so that you are reducing the amount of noise. So if you can set exposures using effectively, the items mentioned on this diagram, so that you keep your ISO down, the sensitivity, but you let the light into the aperture for a little bit longer, then you can create a variety of exposures that you can join together. And I put them into Photoshop so that you've got nice, clean, there's not much noise in the image at all, and you can put those together in what's called high dynamic range image. So, camera technology has come on so far from some of the early electronic sensors, from which we had following kind of real film, where it was a chemical process rather than a series of little pixels that, or what are they called? They're called, I can't remember the name for them, but they have a name for each individual little light bucket that collects the light that comes into the camera.
Each one of the cells.
Yeah, there's a special name for it, and I should know it because I wrote it I researched it for the book that I was working on. But there we go.
I call them pixel webs. That's what I always call them. And yes, you're right. It's basically like a bucket, and you're bringing in photons, and then we electronically count how many photons that are in there, and we say, okay, here's a value for that piece.
Yes.
And as you were saying, that sensitivity, because make this very sensitive, but you also remember these sensors can also pick up things like electromagnetic interference. They can bring in radiation, all kinds of different things affect it. And that's what affects that noise you're talking about.
Well, the reality is the sensitivity is created by additional charge. So there's slightly more electricity effectively put through the sensor. And as that increases, so does the amount of noise. So that's why it's always advisable to keep the ISO as low as possible. And some cameras now will go as low as 80 ISO. But it's a standard set in photography that allows for sort of sensitivity. So yeah, just as an aside. But Jim, before we came on air, as it were, I said I had a present for you. Can you guess what it is?
Did.
I said I had a present. Guess what it is?
I have an idea.
Yeah.
Only because we were talking about medium and we were talking about models. But could it be that?
It's something along those lines. Let me. Okay. I got you your very own. And this was before I presented. It was made in Facebook Spaces. It was not made in Medium. This was made in Facebook Spaces in about the space of 5 minutes before I presented it. Okay, your very own Facebook Spaces VuzeXR camera. It's even got XR on the side. There you go.
Look at that.
Look at that.
You've got some serious skill there.
I wouldn't put that through an engineering. I wouldn't make engineering diagrams out of it, but yeah.
I just wonder if I could take that and turn it into a font pack and make it into a new logo for the.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's my gift to you. But do you know what? I thought you're the sort of guy that probably wants to use it in 360 mode and 180. So I got you another one. Not just one camera, but 2 VuzeXR cameras. Actually, they're both in 180 mode. So I'm going to borrow this one for a while. So these are in 180 mode, but as I say, I wouldn't make engineering drawings from my Facebook Spaces efforts, but I drew these in Facebook Spaces, a little sketch. Incidentally, if anyone knows how to get OBJ files or FBX files into Facebook Spaces, I'd be very interested to know. You can get them through Medium, but yeah, it's a little bit tricky at the moment. But so I made these. I'm
just digging in here for a second to see. I'm just going to grab. We'll put this in the background here.
On the table. By the way, you can stick these to your your face as well. But
I think it's very similar. Oh, that's awesome.
So anyway, there we go.
So I put a little diagram in the back.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, mine's not quite photorealistic yet, but it's getting there. So yeah, there you go. That's my present to you today, Jim.
Thank you very much.
No expense spared.
I'll have to get something for you next time.
Okay, no expense spared there. So, what I might do, Jim, is just show a couple of the other images that I've created with that exposure that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'd love to. Because you've got a lot of spheres there, and I think one of the things that we didn't do enough of last time in our talk is really go through and show some different work. And so even though I'm with a camera manufacturer, you're the one that's out there actually using the equipment every day and making amazing things. So I'd love to see what you have back there and show us how you're kind of pushing the limits of the technology to do something cool.
Okay, well, since I last spoke to you a couple of weeks ago, I'd been to London, which, as you can see behind you. And when I went to London in the last week or so, I've really been making an effort to try some different things. As I say, the exposure, the multiple exposure experiments that I've been doing. But I took this one when I came back last week in Chester. So this is down by the canal. And let me just turn off the table for a moment. I'm just going to turn that off so we can kind of. So again, I exposed separately for the sky, and then I exposed. You can see the canal boats, and you can see. Let me just flip the camera around here, so you can see all around it. You've got a very high dynamic range. Hi, Jim, and it's a nice scene, especially in May as the blossoms coming out, and you've got the colourful boats there. So you're getting a really sharp image. You're getting a nice high dynamic range, but the clouds, you can really see the detail in the clouds there, and they're not being blown out. Otherwise, if you took like single exposure with any 360 camera, you would have to expose for a certain amount of area because the sensors in all digital cameras have not quite reached the sensitivity of the human eye yet. So you're always competing with the human eye. So that's why it's easier to see things at night, and it's you tend to find that cameras have a lot of noise when they try to photograph things in the dark. So that's one that I'd like to show.
And just so you know, and for our viewers to know, we are working to incorporate some automated HDR functionality and bracketing into it to make this whole process a little bit easier for you. So it's certainly on our radar. My background, I come out of camera companies. I know what needs to be done. It's just a matter right now of making sure we're balancing all the pieces that we need in order to make as many people happy as we can and continue to push the boundaries on capabilities of the technology.
But I think one thing I would say is that I would use that automation. I think that'd be a very exciting thing. But sometimes there is a need to almost take separate exposures and manually, because no camera anywhere knows necessarily what the scene is about.
Exactly.
And so
exactly what you're trying to do
here, I did cut around the sky a little more, or I manually kind of exposed for the sky by adjusting which parts of 2 or 3 images appeared on the same image, then flatten the entire Photoshop file down, and it does give you even more control. But it's great to hear that exciting feature is coming along, Jim. Let me just show you.
So here's a question. Here's a question for your viewers, or for the people. Do you have to put any special metadata in so that when you load the JPEGs into either Facebook or anything else to show up as a 360?
It showed up as a 360, no problem. So
Okay.
Photoshop did not remove the metadata. So I was able to take, I think I took three different images and laid them on top of another, basically cherry picked which parts I wanted from the underexposed, the overexposed, and the correct exposure. And then for the shadows, for the highlights, etc. Combine them all, flatten them all, and it didn't remove the metadata. So that was great.
Well done.
So,
so
that
what else you have.
saves a bit of.
I saw a whole bunch of these spheres, and every one of these spheres is another photo, right?
Yes, absolutely. Here's a little experiment I did, and I posted it. Let me just do the face thing that you showed me last time. Right. So
there you go.
So what I did was I was doing some work in a studio, which I'll tell you about in a minute. I was doing some Matterport photography, and I created this little montage. So here's my entire guitar collection. I'm sure people don't need to hear me talk about how much I like my guitar collection, but I combined one of the images that you just saw of the sky and the studio image, and then made it into a little montage of the studio. Let me just find the.
I think if anything, we should incorporate some of your music in these.
In the background of it's.
Either in the background or into
Absolutely. Well, you know that I wouldn't turn down a chance to show off my music, Jim. So, again, let me just flip the camera around for a moment. Let me just flip the camera out. So what I did here was the same thing. Want to give us a wave, Jim? I exposed for the shadows. Let me just turn off the table here. Exposed for the shadows, and so the blacks are nice and sort of clear. There's not much noise in those. You get a nice red on the guitar. The bright isn't blowing out, the brightness of the light, and you're getting detail in all of the roof as well. So again, 3 images taken of this, and then I combined the areas I wanted to really pull out the shadows, and again, it created quite a nice montage there. So
absolutely well done.
Yeah, so it's nice to kind of really use that feature where you hold down on the preview screen on the VuzeXR app, and it gives you a little sort of meter. You can add brightness or reduce the exposure time, and
as you slide it up or down, basically it turns from it comes to a moon, meaning it's darker, and sun to brighter, and it's quite easy to use, very intuitive.
Yep. So let me just so there's that, and here's another one from London, actually quite close to where we were standing before. So again, I just used a couple of exposures on this one, I think. Let me just go back to here. So I went down on what I wouldn't describe this as a beach, but it's basically a little sort of pier there, and I wanted to just add a little more detail into the shadow areas, and I think that's where that feature really comes in. But again, let's have a look. So the sky got a tiny bit blown out around the sun, but it's near impossible not to get that. Not many people can expose for the sun. So, but 99% of the image is nicely covered there. So yeah.
Well done. I think one thing that people forget, so that a 360 camera, VR camera, whatever you want to call them, it's a tool. And yes, we want to get the very best image quality out of that tool as we can. But a lot of the creative process happens post-capture and in your post workflow. And it looks like you've used Photoshop as that kind of tool to help you to build what you want. And that's one of the reasons we went with an open industry file format for both the still images as well as the videos, so that we can work seamlessly into all third-party applications to make great-looking products.
Absolutely.
In fact, I got a buddy of mine who uses Snapseed. So he'll shoot a full 360, transfer it directly to his mobile phone, and then use Snapseed to do all kinds of things to it, and pushes it right up to Facebook. And within literally seconds, he's done. Pretty cool.
Amazing. Yeah. Great stuff. Well, look, let me just remove a couple of these for a moment. So what are the plans what do you got planned in the next few weeks?
That's a good question. So I'm going to head off the week of May 20th, I'm going to head out to New York City.
Right.
We're working with a company called Arcimoto. Arcimoto is a manufacturer of electric cars. They have a little 3-wheeled car, and they used our technology to make a virtual driving experience that takes you through the Oregon hills, and they're working on putting together a rescue scenario for one of their first responder vehicles.
Right.
And they're going to have the vehicles at the show in New York, but then you'll sit in there, hold the steering wheel, and watch a video as you go through this tour.
Oh wow! Okay.
And,
yeah.
It's really, it's really a fun vehicle, but it's even more fun to actually to actually have that sensation, actually have your hands on the controls, and actually like, whee, look at me go. So that kind of stuff is really fun. And then after that, I'm not sure what's on my list next.
Which camera did you use for the experience with the vehicle?
We did the VuzeXR.
Okay.
And we did a couple different scenarios with it. One we did as a 3D VR.
Okay.
So single point of view. So as you're riding, you get a very stable view, and you get the 3D.
Yep.
And then we also did it a similar experience in 360 degree as well. Now that's a 2D experience, but I have to tell you, I'm quite impressed with how it looks in the headset.
Okay. I mean, again, for me, last time we discussed the 3D experience is really what I pursued. I mean, these are 2D 360 images. But as far as video goes, I'm always gravitate towards the 3D experience. But
one that gives the most impact and the greatest kind of presence that you're there, which is why but they had a couple scenarios that they wanted to show 360. So you know what?
Absolutely.
It's a creative decision. But I personally am a huge fan of 3D in a headset. For anything that's closer than about 25 feet, 30 feet out, call it 10 meters and closer, 3D makes a big difference.
Absolutely. Beyond that, it tends to tail off a little bit, but that's the trick with 3D imaging, is to create a point of interest relatively close to you. If you get too close, it can cause eye strain, but within 2-3 meters, if that's where the activity that you're recording is going on, it can have a really big impact. Interestingly, you sent me.
We can even see it. We can even see it right here. So from here to those boats, that first set of boats right there, it looks like, hey, you know what? That's a long ways. But then from the second boat, over here. Let's go this way, actually.
You grab the camera.
Let me grab this real quick. Yeah, so this is the boat that I'm talking about behind you here. So then from this ferry, so the distance from here to here looks really big, right?
Yes.
But from here to here, it looks very compressed. And that's because of this 3D look. But the distance between here and here is actually greater. You know what I mean? So than it is from here to here. It's just because it's closer to our eyes, that's the way it looks. Yes. And so that's why 3D becomes such a important tool for things that are relatively close to you.
Absolutely.
I'll let you take control of that again if you want.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, actually, let's move on to something related that you discussed a couple of weeks ago, and you sent me we talked about the Greenscreen challenge. Let me just bring the table back. Now, I took you up on the challenge. And in fact, I think I'm in my little VR room now, and I'm standing on the green screen. But I prepared a little video to explain what I put together. I didn't do a final 3D green screen video, because if I did, I'd want to spend a long time on it. But what I did was a little test, just to prove the point and to explain how I would go about it, and how I would recommend you go about it, and how people can experiment with that. So what I did was I created, let's just put this on the screen here. I created a video. I just want to rewind that and pause it. So let's just make sure people can see this video. Let's get it in the right
way here a little bit.
There we go. Just a tiny bit. If I turn off the table, will it turn off the video? It probably will. Let me just test.
Yeah, well,
no, we're good. We're good. The only problem is I don't have the controls for the video, so I'm going to have to bring back the table. Okay, so this is my spare room, which is the VR room. As you can see, it looks a little bit cluttered, but that's mainly because it's full of green screen and lighting. So what I did, as you can see all around, you can see bits of the lights. One of the key issues with green screen is to, well, first of all, get a large piece of green material, but have sufficient lighting that you can evenly light, or make sure the green is evenly lit across it. Because otherwise, removing the green from the scene is just that little bit harder. So the first effort I made was to get as many lights as I could around the scene. And what I then did was I put it into Premiere Pro. So I recorded this. I just recorded it in 4K. You could do 5.7. I'd be very interested to see what 5.7 looks like. And in fact, it will make the keying even better, because you then have more fine detail to go around the edge of myself there, as it were, or whatever you're recording. I then put it into Premiere Pro and use the crop tool to then crop it down. So I'm doing some sort of like strange taxi driver Robert De Niro thing going on there, which is basically, look, there's me, I'm on the film. But what I was doing was I was actually looking on the Vuse app. Now, if you see what I'm doing now, so I try and find the limits, because one of the important things, when you have a small space, and I actually created a music video last summer, The Journey, which was my first green. Let me just grab this image. I don't know if people have seen this, but this was the first video I created called The Journey. And actually,
that was great.
Thanks, Jim. I created that using Greenscreen. So Vuse and Humanized Technologies actually very kindly donated the background images. Originally, there was kind of this space scene, but I wasn't very happy with it. And I talked to Yahav, and he said, hey, we have some desert. I actually wanted to go to the desert originally, but to take all that equipment, to get it right, everything, it would have been a huge project beyond where I was at that time. So I used Greenscreen and put myself in the desert with a friend of mine who played keyboard. And you can actually see this video at bit.ly/journey-3D. And I'll put that on the actual Facebook posting. But it used Greenscreen principles to remove me playing guitar from the background so I could place myself in the scene. So here what I was doing was taking the 3D from the Vuse camera and then cropping it. So I cropped it just within the limits. And why I mentioned the music video was I'm actually exploring the limitations of the green area, because when I was recording the guitar, what I didn't want was the guitar going out of the scene. Otherwise, you can't crop around it. So you need to know how far can you wave your hands around here? Well, no, it's going outside of the green screen. And when you're using the camera at a distance, and there is a certain distance that works as a minimum distance, you don't want it like half a meter away. Otherwise, it's really going to put strain on your eyes when you then play that back. So you need to know how much space can I move within the green area. So let's just take this back so people can see again. So I didn't have a huge amount of space. And what's interesting about this is obviously we're encouraging people to experiment in all sorts of situations, whether you're at home, whether you have a green screen at work. But most people don't have a green screen at work unless you work in TV. So you can do this from home. So what I did, as I said before, was apart from doing the strange impression, find the limitations of the green that I can move within, and then use keying. And I won't go into too much detail, but within Premiere Pro, you can actually use what's called a key, where you select the green color you want to remove, and it will remove the color. So now the video plays. Actually, it's actually keyed me quite heavily, so I look sort of slightly bald. It's probably what I'm going to look like in about sort of 20, I don't know, maybe sooner, 10 years or something. So now I'm completely removed from the background. So that's a little bit closer up there. Now, what? Just if you bear with me.
So then you can just layer this over. Okay, go
over whatever. So what I did was then found the most obnoxious colors just to see how accurate the keying was. So you can see. I don't know if you can see here. What I do now is zoom in. This is just on the Premiere Pro video, just to demonstrate how accurate the key was. You can see just here. There's a little bit where it's not keyed properly, and that is as a result of not lighting the green background as well as it could be lit. So the ideal, and this is why you have multi-million-pound studios that have the perfect green lighting, and when you see video of people being recorded in them, it looks really strange. Well, that's because the lighting is incredibly flat to ensure that people can be cut out of the background. I'm just working from my VR room, as it were, and so I've zoomed into the shot. just to show it's not perfect. And with improved lighting, so now for some reason I'm scratching my chin. I also found the most obnoxious colors on the Adobe Universal Header just to try a bit of video in the background. And that is obviously 2D video on a 3D, on the 3D video I originally recorded of myself. So that was just to test how it generally looked. And then I took a still, the still that we looked at earlier, but I took a 3D version of this in 180, and I superimposed myself on that. Now, what's quite interesting was that was taken in 5.7K, but the video was 4K. But I was able in Premiere Pro to reduce the size down of the background so that it became a 4K image, and it works. It works nicely. Actually, saying that I haven't tested that, but it will work. It will work because it's complete. It's divided exactly down the middle there, and there's very small differences between the two. But that's where the subtle depth comes in. So that's my green screen. I don't know, Jim. Do you want to give me marks out of 10 for that? That's my green screen experiment. It was the best I could do.
I'm going to give you an 11. I'm going to give you 11 out of that because A, I saw the size of the laboratory you were working with.
It's very generous to call it a lab, but yeah, okay.
B, you did something that is absolutely, spot on for exactly what we're trying to do. And, 3, I think it becomes the inspiration for anybody to try, right? So proof of concept to say, hey, you know what? This here is possible. And imagine if, to your point, you put the effort in, you have a proper studio, you got all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's just another creative tool. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. I would have liked if I had, say, a month that I could put towards this. Yes, which is what I did with the journey. I would like to go ahead. I don't want to create a half finished or a half effort on a final 3D example or a final green screen example, but I wanted to prove the point, and this is how I made the journey, and this is how I would and will in the future make a more full-scale sort of green screen VuzeXR video. And I'd like to make it in 5.7K, because just going back to some of the issues I mentioned earlier, when you're actually cutting the background out, the resolution of the video is quite important as to how accurate that is cut out as well. So in 4K, you actually find that the edge of people, because the resolution has limits like any 4K video, obviously the more resolution you put in, the more around the edge of you that Premiere Pro has to work with when it's looking for where does the green start and where does it end, where do I need to cut out. It now has more data to work with. So again, it'll be a very interesting challenge to see if someone creates this kind of thing with 5.7K video. I think in some ways cutting out the person or the thing, it doesn't have to be a person, but cutting out whatever is being green screened will actually be slightly easier.
Yeah, I suspect we're going to see quite a bit of this, because what's really interesting is if you once you do this process, even if you don't love where that subject is in the depth of your view, you can also change the disparity or the distance between them and actually force a more or less of a 3D effect after you've recorded it. And so I think it adds a tremendous amount of flexibility and again, back to it being another creative tool, but it really opens up all kinds of doors.
Yeah, and for me, the interesting thing is, say if I was making a music video, and this could be, it may be somebody else that's a lead singer, or it could be a guitarist or whatever. I could then place them on a background later, saying, look, let's capture the action first, and let's look for the interesting background. So that could have been video. And actually, I did have some video, but it was of a stream, so it was kind of me standing there hovering over this stream. So the other thing to bear in mind is make a note of the height of the Vuse camera when you record yourself, and make a note of the height when you actually finally record the location you want to put in the background, because they need to be the same. Otherwise, you will find that you'll either be hovering, or you'll give the appearance of hovering, or be, below the ground or something like that. There'll be a strange effect that goes on. So it's one important note. The second important note is I actually...
That's a pro tip.
Okay, all right. This is my second green screen experiment. I would like to say that, but thank you. Yes. The other thing that when I was testing out the VuzeXR, and at any camera like this, there is as we discussed earlier, going to be a limit as to how close you can put the camera before you really start getting eye strain or it doesn't look right. So for me, I think if we go right back to the beginning briefly, that was the distance. So we're talking about that's about 1.5 meters away before. Yeah, so I'm about 1.5 meters there. The distance in the end doesn't matter, but the height of the camera for the background is absolutely crucial.
Sure, absolutely. Well done. Like I said, I give you an 11 for that.
You give me 11 like Spinal Tap, 11 out of 10.
Exactly. And so we're going to go to further extend the challenge. And if anybody else that's watching this wants to make some green screen or whatever, please put it in the comments. Send us a link. We'd love to see what you do. And then also reach out to Peter. And if you've got a project that you can put Peter on, I'm sure he'd be willing to entertain building something for you.
I'd be very interested. Yeah, absolutely. So how are we going to finish off today, Jim? Would you like to, is there anything else you'd like to cover before we head out into the sunset? No, there's the sunset's over there. So anything else?
No, I think this was a really healthy conversation. You know what I would love to do is I'd love to find our next discussion and define something to talk about. And one of the things that's really near and dear to my heart are things like virtual tours and being able to get out and, you know, whether it's real estate or whether it's on my vacation or holiday or so. Why don't we agree that next time we get in, we'll talk about virtual tours and some of the technologies that are used to build VR tours and how people are starting to interact with this media to either sell something or communicate differently or to physically or not physically, I guess, but to digitally move around an environment.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. Well, thanks very much for watching, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, and hey, thanks for the gift.
Hey, no problem at all. Anytime, no problem. Bye-bye.
Well done. Bye.
Bye.